This is Portraiture Lesson 5, final piece, where we're looking at how to create a portrait of your own. These are a few of the most famous portrait paintings that you may recognise, particularly the Mona Lisa, which was Leonardo da Vinci's portrait that he absolutely loved and refused to give to his client. You can see that they're all quite different. You either got the full figure or just the face. Interesting compositions. When planning a portrait, there's lots to consider. We're going to go through these things in detail. So subject, who you want to paint, your composition, how you place that person within the frame, the lighting, whether it's dramatic lighting or soft lighting, the medium, whether you're going to be painting in oils or watercolour, or whether you want to do a drawing, and then what style. So is it going to be sketchy or detailed or thick paint or thin paint? An important thing when you're starting is to be realistic about the amount of time that you're going to spend on your portrait. This one took me over 250 hours, something like that. That's because I painted it in layers. This is the 5th layer. Each layer I painted, I get more and more detail. And even if you're wanting to do a charcoal sketch, when I did this one, it definitely takes me at least 2 days work. So I'm painting 5 hours a day. Don't think that incredibly detailed pictures are done very quickly. If you do want to do this particular style, which is high definition, it might be better with the time that you have to do a small section. Then you can really spend a lot of time putting layer upon layer and getting more and more detail. The subject. So you need to choose somebody that you're really happy to look at very closely for a long period of time, because you really do have to look so closely at every detail. If you're doing it from a photograph, which is probably easier when you're starting out, the reason why it's easier to do it from a photograph is because your composition is already decided for you. It's also flat already. The lighting's been decided for you. The amount of focus, everything that's in detail has been decided already. Obviously, you can change that a bit when you're doing it, but it's really helpful to have as much information as possible. Make sure that when you choose a photograph or take a photograph, you've got everything in high definition and all the detail that you need. When you do a portrait that's from life, it tends to be much quicker and more sketchy perhaps, because you don't have the same amount of time. People don't stay still for very long. But you do have much more information to work from when you're looking at your subject in person. Self-portraits are a really good option if you have a mirror, because then you can be posing for yourself for as long as you need to. Here are some famous self-portraits through time. So again, we have Leonardo, Rembrandt, Courbet. It's clever to draw a self-portrait where he's not got the paintbrush in hand and he's creating such a dramatic picture. That's quite a hard thing to do, but it really, really interesting. You can see what I mean about dramatic lighting. We've got this harsh white and darks and this interesting pose. Van Gogh, Picasso is doing a much more expressive portrait rather than a realistic portrait. The same with Gauguin. These aren't portraits that are photographic, but they are describing that character. Composition. Consider whether you want to show the whole body and the face or just part of it. You may not need to put the whole head within the frame. You may cut off sections. You may want to get the whole figure in. You may want to look at an interesting angle. What I tend to do when I think about the character that I'm painting, is this person really engaging? Do they really want you to look at them? In that case, I tend to do them looking directly at you. If my sitter is more shy and quieter kind of person, I often have them looking out of the frame, so they're not really engaging with you as a viewer. This manga illustrator has created some really nice sketches. If you look at these compositions, he has them all in really interesting poses. It's really worth considering how you place your sitter to really describe that person. Lighting is essential when you're doing a portrait, not only because it helped you to decide whether you're going to have sharp detail or whether your picture is going to be much softer. As you can see from these pictures, the direction of your light makes a massive difference on the mood of your portrait. If you're taking a photograph of your sitter and you have a lamp, you may be able to try moving your lamp around to see how the shadows fall on the face. It is helpful when you're painting to have some shadows. If you have no shadows at all, it's quite hard to define all the features. The next thing to consider is what medium that you want to use. Would you like to use watercolor or oils or acrylic, digital art, pastels, collage, pencil, ink, fine liner? There are so many ways. If we're looking at style in more detail, you could consider using oils or acrylic. Oils are a bit more expensive than acrylic, so people tend to use acrylic. Also, acrylic paint is water-based, whereas oils you need to buy special thinners. And also many of the thinners that you use can be toxic. I tend to use a walnut oil. I find acrylic quite hard to use because of the way I paint. I try and get very, very smooth blends, and this is hard to do in acrylic because it dries very quickly. But if I'm painting in this style, where you're using thick paint, putting the paint on the canvas very roughly, and you don't need to get those smooth blends, acrylic works really well. You can see how many different colours you can use. It doesn't have to be completely realistic in terms of skin tone to build up and create a really effective portrait. The nice thing about oils and acrylic also is that if you make a mistake, you can easily paint over them. That's very helpful, and it gives you a bit of leeway. You can also add thinners like water and use your acrylic in very, very thin layers. The way I paint would be to paint a thin layer underneath and then paint the next layer and slowly build up my detail. So you're letting each layer dry before you add the next layer on. And then it gives you this kind of depth, and it can help to make it more 3D. Watercolor is very different. And in a way, it's harder. It's quite nice for doing sketches, but it's less forgiving because once you've put it down, it's quite hard to go over any mistakes. So you need to be quite sure of what you're doing with watercolor. You can add white, but it will make it more pasty, which may work for skin. But the wonderful thing about watercolor is how translucent and how vibrant the colors are, because you're seeing through the paint and the white of the page is shining, and that gives you really lovely, vibrant colors. And also with watercolor, the pigment is being moved around in an organic way, which can create beautiful effects. This can be done by putting the pigment onto wet paper, so wet on wet. Whereas if you want to get fine detail, you can paint watercolor onto a dry surface. With a sharp pencil or a pen, you can get really fine detail in a portrait because you have much more control than you do with paint. And also, pens and pencils are really nice for quick sketches. You can smudge the pencil and you could do more stylized or more cartoon style drawings. And you can also use colored pencil too. It can be a really nice way of blending color into your picture. Digital art, if you really like drawing on the computer and you find that easy, you can put a photograph underneath your layer and then create a new layer and paint on top of that. So it's quite an easy way of tracing. It's also very good for a more cartoon style because you can create your outline and then you can do an infill, and very quickly you can colour in sections and build up your picture that way. They don't have to be realistic. You don't have to go from a photograph. You can also use all sorts of filters and paintbrush tools to create pictures that look almost like you're using oils or watercolor. It's a good way of experimenting too, because if you don't like what you've done, you can keep undoing and redoing before you come up with your final piece. The task is to paint or draw a finished portrait. There are so many ways that you can go about this. My advice would be to look through lots and lots of pictures of portraits, which is why I've included so many pictures in this PowerPoint. You choose a portrait artist whose style you really like, and you attempt to then use their style to paint your own portrait. If you really want, you could copy their portrait, but it'd be nice, if you're feeling brave, to create a portrait of your own, of somebody that you know, and use just the style of that artist. You can also look back through the lessons that we've already done. The face proportions, remembering that the eyes are halfway down the face, and the body proportions, remembering that the pelvic bone is halfway down the body, so your legs are half the length of your body. And like we did before, the way to start is to sketch out the simple shapes. So look at your geometric shapes, put in your measurements, and then build up the detail piece by piece. The proportions don't need to be perfect. Sometimes the best portraits manage to capture a character of a person without being photographic. If you are going to work from a photograph and you want to be very, very accurate with your picture, you can try using one of these methods. In all these methods, you need to print out a full-size photo of your subject to work from. The picture that you print out is going to be the same size as your portrait. Once you have your photocopy or your printout, you can try out one of these methods. So with the trace transfer method, you can fairly lightly trace over the important sections of your portrait. Try and be as accurate as you can. If you're doing eyebrows, I would do them with lines rather than an outline. The same with the hairline. You don't really want a line on the edge of your hairline. Once you've drawn it lightly on one side, you then need to get your pencil onto this side, ready for you to be able to print it. The picture needs to be in that orientation, so you can turn these both over, and on the underside you can get a soft pencil. A B pencil is good. You want to put some of the pencil lead onto each of those lines. Now I have pencil on both sides of my picture. It's made an imprint of this direction, but I want my picture to be facing this direction. And then you can position your portrait wherever you want on your page, and you can use your hard pen again. This is an HB, but you can use an H. You're printing the pencil lines onto this page. You can lift it up to check. You might want to tape it to make sure that it doesn't move. If it slips, then you can end up putting everything in the wrong place. Now I have a rough drawing of my portrait on my piece of paper. I'm ready to draw it. If you're doing it in watercolour now, you might want to rub out some of this pencil with this kind of rubber so you don't have too many pencil marks underneath that you'll be able to see. And just to reiterate the point that you don't really want an outline for your eyebrows, because then that's hard to get rid of. The same with the hairline. You don't want a hard outline. It's much better to have a few strands of hair. It's a really good way of starting portraiture because it can help you get everything in the right place and then get a real likeness. The thing that tracing isn't so good with is giving you more expression to your portrait. Another method, and one that I use a lot, is the grid method. Because I paint with so many small details, I take a lot of photographs and I build up pictures on Photoshop by cutting and pasting lots of things to place them where I want. Then I print out an image and I make a grid on that image measuring each square. Then I create another grid on the canvas that I'm going to work on. Sometimes I will scale that up, but you can also use exactly the same grid. Then what you do is you draw on your picture one square at a time. It can help to cover over the other squares so you're not really disturbed by the rest of the picture, and you can then look in your first square. What do you see? You have this line that comes about halfway, so you could draw that. Then you could go to the next square down and carry on that line, and you just go a square at a time. And when you're looking in your square, you're seeing, well, what shape fits into this square, and you can translate that onto your picture, and it really helps you place everything in the right place before you begin. Another method I could use to keep my picture less traced but to still get everything in the right position is called the line-up method. This piece of paper is the same size. With this method, you're measuring across to see what is in line in different places. I would be able to see, for example, that that's on that section, and you could just go a little bit at a time. You can also measure across. This is where that head meets the pillow at this height, and you can slowly build up your portrait that way. This measuring method could help you place out everything ready to go into more detail. I would always advise sketching out your portrait. Check where the egg shape of your head is. Use your eye line, your front of the face line. Sketch lightly before you go in and do your final piece. These are some interesting portraits that I've found when I've been looking online. Many of them come from Pinterest, as you can see with this little symbol on them. If you're able to get a Pinterest account, you can find some amazing images on there, and maybe even some good photographs to work from if you don't want to take your own. Have a look through all of these, and maybe one of these styles might inspire you. Maybe you would be interested in using pastels. Maybe you could use a darker coloured paper. Maybe you could use mixed media, where you use watercolour with pen or ink. This one has been traced, then the watercolour has been added in. Here are some ink ones and pen. All of these are quite realistic, but you don't have to be realistic. I love these two paintings where you've got all the different colours. You wouldn't imagine you could put a large blob of red on somebody's face and for it to look great, or somebody's arm, or blue on their back, and yet these come together really beautifully. This one's quite interesting. That looks very complicated style. This has been done digitally on a computer. Charcoal, you can get very soft images with charcoal. Winslow uses a very scribbly style when he does his portraits. These two are both pastel, which can create quite a soft finish. This one's quite interesting, where you're showing a few different views at the same time, but probably a bit complex for what we're doing right now. The main thing I'd like you to remember is that getting a likeness in portraiture is one of the hardest things that you can do in art. So be kind to yourself, allow for mistakes, and take time to develop your skills, because it's all about practice. You will get better, even if you feel like it's a disaster. To capture a likeness is really hard, but don't let that put you off, because it's also really rewarding and really fun. So good luck, have fun, and I'd love to see how you got on.